My daughter-in-law once told my son that I made her feel like a tenant in her own home. He texted me that on a Tuesday morning while I was driving to pick up lumber. I pulled over. I read it twice. Then I put my phone in the cup holder and drove the rest of the way to the hardware store without responding. That was the last day I paid their mortgage. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a perfect man. I have made mistakes with my son that I carry like stones in my coat pockets. I know the weight of them. So when I say that what happened over the following year changed me, I don't mean it made me bitter. I mean it burned away everything that wasn't load-bearing and showed me what was actually holding the structure up. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial HVAC installation in the Denver metro area, and I know how to read a building. I know when something looks solid from the outside and is hollow inside. I know when the framing is wrong before the drywall goes up. I thought I knew my son. I thought I had built something in him that would hold. His name is Calvin. He is 34. His wife is Renata. She is 32, and she is the kind of woman who has never once in her life considered that she might be wrong about something. I don't say that with anger anymore. I say it the way a doctor says a diagnosis: factual, clinical, useful. They have a daughter. Her name is Ren. She is 6 years old, and she has her father's nose and her great-grandmother's stubbornness. And she is the reason I get up in the morning. The mortgage I was paying was $2,340 a month on a 4-bedroom house in Arvada. I had co-signed the loan 3 years earlier because Calvin's credit wasn't strong enough and Renata's wasn't either, and they needed a place to live because Ren was coming and the apartment was too small. I told myself it was temporary. I would co-sign. They would build their credit. They would refinance in my name out after 18 months. That was the agreement. 18 months came and went. Then 24. Then 36. Every time I brought it up, Renata would go quiet in a specific way she has, a way that means the conversation is over without her having to say so, and Calvin would look at the floor and say they were working on it. I was also paying their car insurance. I was covering Ren's preschool tuition, which was $890.90 a month at a Montessori in Wheat Ridge, because Renata had decided public preschool wasn't good enough. I had bought Calvin a new set of tools when he said he wanted to start doing side work on weekends. Those tools sat in his garage for 11 months still in their packaging. I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you this so you understand what I was to them. I was not a father. I was infrastructure. I was the foundation they built on without ever asking what it cost to pour. That Tuesday text came after a weekend where I had come over to help Calvin fix a leak under their kitchen sink. Renata was upstairs the entire time. She did not come down to say hello. She did not offer coffee. When I finished and called up to let them know I was leaving, she said, "Thanks," from somewhere at the top of the stairs. That was all. Calvin walked me to the door and shrugged in a way that I had learned to read as an apology he could not afford to say out loud. Then the text came 2 days later. "Dad, Renata says she feels like she can't relax in her own home when you're around. She needs you to give us more space. Please don't just show up anymore." I read it 3 times. I looked at the lumber in the back of my truck. I thought about the sink I had just fixed, about the 4-inch section of corroded pipe I had replaced, about the way Calvin hadn't even known how to turn off the water main. I thought about the $2,340 that had left my checking account 4 days earlier. Then I thought, all right, space. I can do space. I called my attorney that afternoon. Her name is Doris, and she has been handling my affairs since my wife passed 8 years ago, and she does not waste words. I told her what was happening. I told her I wanted to stop the mortgage payments. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything since I decided to retire from field work. Doris told me what I needed to know. Since I was co-signer, I had legal exposure if they defaulted. We needed to either get my name off the loan, which required them to refinance, or I needed to formally document the cessation of voluntary payments. She said the cleanest path was to send a certified letter to Calvin notifying him that voluntary supplemental payments would end in 30 days, giving him time to make arrangements. I told her to draft it. She did. I signed it. It went out the next morning. I did not call Calvin first. I did not warn him. He had asked me to give them space. I gave them space. Calvin called me 9 days later. I was eating dinner. He sounded like he had not slept. "Dad," he said, "what is this letter?" It says what it says, I told him. You're pulling the mortgage payment? I am. Dad, we can't. He stopped. I heard him breathing. We can't cover this on our own right now. I know, I said. You've known that for 3 years. That's why we had an agreement about refinancing that was never honored. There was a long silence. I ate a bite of my dinner. Meatloaf. I had made it myself because cooking is one of the things I taught myself after his mother died, and I have gotten good at it. Renata is really upset, he said. Calvin, I said, I am going to say this once, and I am going to say it clearly, and then I am not going to repeat it. Your wife told you she felt like a tenant in her own home when I came to fix your plumbing for free. I am choosing to take her at her word. The house is now your responsibility. That is what tenants do. They take responsibility for their own home. He was quiet again. I love you, I said. I will always love you. But I am not going to keep financing a life that has no room for me in it. I hung up. I finished my dinner. I washed the dish. I went to bed. I will not lie to you and say I slept well. I did not. I lay in the dark for a long time thinking about Calvin at 7 years old, the way he used to follow me around the garage handing me tools, saying their names wrong on purpose to make me laugh. Ratchet Satchel. Pliers Plier. That kid. I thought about where that kid went, and whether he was still in there somewhere under the debt and the bad decisions and the woman he had married. Around 2 in the morning my phone buzzed, a text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. This is Renata. I need you to understand that what you're doing is financial abuse. We have a child. If you pull that payment, Ren suffers. That is on you. Not us. You. I put the phone face down on the nightstand. I did not respond that night. In the morning, I forwarded the text to Doris and asked her to add it to the file. Then I went out to my garage and started organizing my workbench, because that is what I do when I need to think. I put every tool in its right place. I wiped down the surfaces. I found a bag of cedar chips I had been meaning to use, and breathed in the smell and felt, somewhere underneath the grief and the anger, something that might have been peace trying to get through. Ren had been staying with me every other weekend since she was old enough to ask for it. She called them her grandpa weekends. She brought a small pink backpack with her pajamas and her stuffed rabbit named Clover and the library book that we would read together on Friday night before bed. That arrangement had been in place for over a year, agreed upon verbally with Calvin and Renata, nothing formal. 2 weekends after I sent the letter, I drove to their house to pick her up for our scheduled weekend. Calvin answered the door. He looked bad. He had lost weight. There were circles under his eyes that reminded me of how his mother looked in the last months. She's not here, he said. Where is she? Renata took her to her mother's place. I looked at him for a long time. That was a choice you two made together. He looked at his shoes. I know. Tell Renata that Ren is always welcome at my house. My door is open. Nothing about that changes. But I will not chase. I drove home. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes. I did not cry, but it was close. 3 days later, I called a family law attorney named Gordon, who a neighbor had recommended, not to fight, to understand what I had. In Colorado, grandparents have limited but real rights to petition for visitation if they can demonstrate an established relationship with the grandchild has been disrupted. I had a year of documented regular visits. I had photos. I had Ren's drawings on my refrigerator, dated on the back in her mother's own handwriting from when she used to think I was useful. Gordon told me I had a reasonable case if it came to that. I told him I hoped it would not come to that. But I filed the documentation anyway, because I have been in this business long enough to know that hoping a wall is straight and checking it with a level are two different things. What I had not anticipated was what happened at Ren's school. Her kindergarten teacher, a woman named Ms. Polly who has been teaching for 22 years and can read a child the way I read a building, called me at the number I had given as an emergency contact when Renata and Calvin first enrolled Ren. She called because Ren had cried at lunch 2 days in a row, and when Miss Polly asked her what was wrong, Ren said, I miss my grandpa, and nobody will tell me when I get to see him. I had to pull over again, different truck, same feeling. Ms. Polly told me she had noted the conversation in Ren's file. She asked if there was something the school should be aware of regarding family circumstances. I thanked her and told her I hoped it would be resolved soon. What I didn't say was that I'd driven past Ren's school 3 times that week just to feel close to something. That Friday I showed up to her school at pickup time. I did not announce it. I did not ask permission. I was listed as an approved pickup contact, had been for a year, and that status had never been formally revoked. I signed her out. I walked out holding her hand. She held on with both of hers. "Grandpa," she said when we got to my truck, "I thought you forgot about me." "I could never forget about you," I said. "Not in a million years, not if someone scrambled my brain with a spoon." She laughed at that. She had her rabbit in her backpack. We went to get ice cream. Then we went to the park. Then I brought her home at 5 o'clock, and I walked her to the door. And Renata was standing there with her phone in her hand, and her face arranged in a way that told me she had been composing something terrible to send me. She looked at Ren. She looked at me. "She's fine," I said. "She had ice cream, mint chip, her favorite." Renata said nothing. Ren went inside. I walked back to my truck. The next morning, I received a text from Calvin. "You can't just take her without telling us." I forwarded that to Gordon along with the school sign-out sheet showing my approved status. Then a certified envelope arrived at my house. A restraining order application alleging that I had taken Ren without consent and created an unsafe environment. I read through it in my kitchen. I made coffee. I read it twice more. It said things about me that bore no resemblance to the man I have been for 63 years. It used words like erratic and intimidating. It said Renata feared for Ren's safety in my presence. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the sink, the mortgage, the Montessori tuition, the tools still in their packaging, the 2 in the morning text about financial abuse. And I thought about Ren, 6 years old, telling her teacher she thought I had forgotten her. I called Gordon. I told him we were not going to wait anymore. What happened in the courtroom over the following 6 weeks, I will not dramatize for you. It is not something that deserves drama. It is something that deserves honesty. A judge reviewed the documentation. He reviewed the school records. He reviewed the text messages, including Renata's 2 in the morning message, including Calvin's message after I picked Ren up, which inadvertently acknowledged that I was an approved contact. He reviewed the photographs of Ren at my home over the preceding 14 months. He reviewed a statement from Miss Polly. The restraining order was denied. Grandparent visitation was granted. 2 weekends a month, Friday to Sunday, formalized and enforceable. The judge noted that the existing relationship between Ren and me was well established, nurturing, and clearly in the child's best interest to preserve. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the courthouse for a while after. It was a Thursday in March. The mountains were still snow-capped, and the sky was that particular blue you only get in Colorado in late winter. The kind of blue that looks like someone just cleaned it. I did not feel victorious. Victory is for games. I felt like a man who had just found out the foundation was cracked, but the walls were still standing, and now he could finally start the actual repair. I drove home. I called my buddy Tenant, who has known me since we were both working residential construction in our 20s, and who had been telling me for months to stop being so patient with Calvin and Renata. I told him what had happened. He said good in the way he says things, flat and certain, like he's reading a measurement. That evening I was in my garage. I was building a small bookshelf. Ren had told me on our ice cream trip that she didn't have a shelf in her room at my house for the books she kept leaving there. So I was building one. Red oak. Nothing fancy. I measured twice. I cut once. I thought about things. I thought about Calvin. I had not spoken to him directly since the courthouse. I had heard through my sister, who still had contact with him, that he had quit his sales job and picked up work at a warehouse distribution center in Commerce City. Night shift. The kind of work that rearranges what you thought you knew about yourself. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I felt something harder to name. Something close to grief dressed up as hope. I thought about the money. In the weeks after I stopped the mortgage payment, I had met again with Doris. I told her I needed to restructure everything. Not out of spite. Out of care. Out of the understanding that I had been providing without building, that writing checks was not the same as leaving something that lasts. What I set up was this: a trust, irrevocable, administered by a third party I selected, a trust company out of Denver that Doris had worked with for years. All of my liquid assets and my property, outside of my retirement accounts and the house I live in, transferred in. The beneficiary, Ren. The terms: she cannot access the principal until she is 30 years old. At 30, a person knows who they are. At 30, you have made enough mistakes to understand what mistakes cost. At 18, you think you know everything. At 21, you are still performing, knowing everything. At 30, you have been humbled enough to actually learn something. Calvin's name is in the document, not as a beneficiary, as a conditional recipient. A monthly payment of $800, contingent on proof of full-time employment submitted quarterly. Not enough to coast. Enough to breathe. A safety net, not a resting place. If he maintains 5 consecutive years of continuous employment, he receives a one-time payment of $40,000, designated for a home down payment. I put that provision in because of something his mother used to say. She said the difference between a gift and a lesson is whether the recipient has to do anything for it. Giving Calvin money he didn't earn was a gift. Giving him a system that rewards work is a lesson. She would have understood that distinction. She was smarter than both of us. Renata is not in the document. I want to be precise about why. It is not punishment. She cannot be rewarded with something she never built. If she stays with Calvin and he earns his stipend and eventually his home, she benefits from that secondarily. If she does not, she carries with her only what she arrived with. That is not cruelty. That is arithmetic. The night I finished the bookshelf, I stood in the garage and ran my hand along the top edge. There was a small imperfection at the corner where 2 pieces met. I had not cut the miter quite right. I looked at it for a while. Then I left it. There is something important about the record of a human hand in handmade work. Machines make it perfect. People make it real. Wren's first formal visitation weekend under the court order fell on a Friday in April. I drove to their house at 5 in the afternoon. Calvin answered the door. He had a small duffel bag packed for her, her rabbit sticking out of the top. He looked like a man who had been working nights. He looked the way my father looked when I was a kid, which is to say, tired, in a way that had some dignity in it. He handed me the bag. I took it. "Dad," he said. "Yeah." He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the text, about the restraining order, about all of it." He said it fast, like he'd been practicing it in private and needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. I looked at him. This was my son, 34 years old, learning things he should have learned at 20. "I know you are," I said. "I didn't know it had gotten that bad. With the money, with everything. I kept telling myself it would work out." "It will work out," I said. "It's working out right now. It just doesn't feel good yet." He nodded. He wiped his eye with the back of his wrist. He looked past me at Wren, who was already halfway down the porch steps. "Take good care of her," he said. "That's what I do," I said. We drove home with the windows down because Wren asked to. She had Clover on her lap, and she was telling me about a girl in her class named Bea, who had lost a tooth and got $2 from the tooth fairy and thought that was a lot. But Wren thought $5 was more fair and wanted to know my opinion. I told her I thought the tooth fairy probably had a budget she had to work with, same as everybody. Wren considered this very seriously and said that was probably true and that she hoped the tooth fairy had a good boss. I laughed. I laughed the way you only laugh when something is both funny and exactly right. That evening we made dinner together. I let her stir the pasta. She wore the apron I had bought her, yellow with small white daisies, about 6 sizes too big, with the strings wrapped twice around her waist. Flour got on the counter even though we weren't making anything with flour, which is a mystery I have not solved. She told me about Clover's recent adventures and the book we were going to read and the shelf she wanted to see. I showed it to her after dinner. She walked up to it slowly, ran her hand along the top like she was checking the quality. "It's a little bumpy here," she said, touching the corner. "I know," I said. "Is that okay?" "That's where my hand was when I made it," I said. "That's the best part." She looked at me with the particular look children give you when they are deciding whether you are telling the truth or making something up. Then she put 2 of her books on the shelf, one on each end, balanced it out with a small ceramic owl she had picked from a box of things I kept in the spare room, and stepped back to look at her work. "Good," she said with the finality of someone who has just completed something important. I stood in the doorway of that room and watched her arrange her things, and I thought about what I had been, and what I had let happen, and what it had cost. I thought about the checks I had written, that bought nothing except someone else's comfort with their own dysfunction. I thought about Calvin in a warehouse moving inventory at 2 in the morning, learning what effort feels like in the body, learning that sleep tastes different when you've earned it. I thought about what my father used to tell me when I was learning to work with my hands. He said the most dangerous thing in construction is a wall that looks finished when it isn't. You slap drywall over bad framing and you can live in that house for years without knowing. And then one day something shifts and the whole thing cracks and you realize the problem was never the drywall. The problem was always the frame. I spent 35 years building things that stand. I built ventilation systems for hospitals, for schools, for commercial towers in downtown Denver that I can still drive past and point to. I have built things that outlasted the companies that hired me to build them. I thought I could build a family the same way. Pour the money in like concrete, keep it solid, hold everything together. What I understand now is that you cannot build for other people. You can only build the conditions that allow them to build for themselves. The concrete I poured for them just became a floor they stood on without knowing what was underneath, without wondering, without caring. I stopped pouring. They had to find their own footing. That is not abandonment. I want to be clear about that. I did not walk away. I changed what I was building. I shifted from pouring a slab under their feet to building a structure for my granddaughter, something that will still be standing when she is 30 years old and ready to understand what it means. Something she will have to grow into rather than just walk into. And for my son, my stubborn, lost, 34-year-old son who is somewhere in Commerce City tonight stacking boxes and getting tired in ways that might actually save him, I left a door open. I left the set of conditions that reward the only thing that has ever built anything worth keeping: effort, consistency, showing up. Whether he walks through that door is up to him. I have done what I can do. I have secured what needed securing. I have protected what needed protecting. I have given what I can give and stopped giving what was only making things worse. The garage still smells like sawdust and cedar. Wren is asleep in the spare room with Clover on the pillow beside her and 2 books on her new shelf. The mountains are dark shapes against a darker sky outside my window. I have a grandson's worth of time left in me, if I'm lucky. I intend to spend it teaching a 6-year-old that the thing you build with your own hands is the thing that means the most, that bumpy corner and all. Some people call that stubbornness. I call it legacy. The difference is whether anything stands when you're done. I have thought a lot about the word tenant. Renata used it to describe how I made her feel, and I turned it over in my head for weeks, like a stone you keep finding in your shoe. But here is what I kept coming back to. She was the one living in a house I was paying for. She was the one who never once asked what that cost, not in dollars, and not in the other ways a thing can cost a person. If anyone was a tenant in that arrangement, it was me, paying rent on a relationship that had no room for me in it. What I have learned, and what I wish I had understood 30 years ago when I was still making Calvin's world softer than it needed to be, is that actions create the conditions for what comes next. Every check I wrote without accountability taught Calvin that comfort arrives without effort. Every bill I covered without conversation taught Renata that my presence could be managed and my resources could not. That is not their fault entirely. I built that dynamic nail by nail, the same way I built everything else. I just wasn't reading the blueprint carefully enough. The thing about integrity, about being the same person in private that you are in public, about keeping your word to yourself as much as to anyone else, is that you cannot borrow it from somewhere else when you run out. Calvin had never been asked to develop his own. I'd been lending him mine, and a borrowed spine does not hold a man upright when the weight gets real. What changed him was not my anger. It was the warehouse, the night shifts, the back pain, the paycheck that was entirely his own. That is where character gets built, in the doing of the hard thing when no one is coming to make it easier. And Wren, my granddaughter who told her teacher she thought I had forgotten her. She is 6 years old and she already understands something that took me decades to learn, that the people who show up matter more than the people who pay up. She did not miss the mortgage payment. She missed me. That distinction is everything. The wisest thing I did in this entire mess was refuse to let her lose access to that knowledge. The knowledge that she has someone who will show up, who will sit with her, who will build her a shelf with a crooked corner and tell her that the crooked corner is the best part. I am not a saint. I made mistakes that cost my son years she cannot get back. But I am also not a bank, and I am not a floor to be walked on, and I am not invisible just because someone found it convenient to stop seeing me. The moment I stopped absorbing the cost of other people's avoidance and started protecting what actually mattered, things began, slowly, imperfectly, to shift. Calvin is working. Ren has a shelf. The trust is signed. The court order is in place. Some days I drive past a building I worked on 20 years ago, and I look up at it and think, that is still standing. That is still doing what it was built to do. I want to be that kind of father. That kind of grandfather. Not the kind that collapses when the weight gets redistributed. The kind that was built right from the start, that holds even when no one is looking. That is still standing long after the people who doubted it have moved on. That is the only legacy worth leaving. Not money, not property. The example of a man who knew what he was worth and acted accordingly.